Thank you for coming. I've been following the Nuclear Peace Foundation for quite some time, and I have to admit I did this as a selfish thing because when I was in the public health service, I did a lot of monitoring for fallout from the weapons testing, and I found out that some people were really being exposed to high levels, not like you will hear about in the Marshall Islands, but it was involved in such a way that I realized we were making some very bad decisions testing weapons out in the open and exposing people to fallout. And this was just the fallout I was concerned with. Can you imagine if you lived in Nagasaki? So, I mean, it's something that I think is very important, and I think it's really a humanitarian issue for the world to make sure that we do all we can to eliminate, not just reduce, the nuclear weapons, because they're really, if you can even imagine a nuclear war breaking out, you can just bend over and kiss yourself goodbye. So the world just goes to hell in a handbasket real quick. So the talk today is, of course, the U.S. nuclear policy, the nuclear zero lawsuit, and the arms race. And he'll be talking about the state of the nuclear weapons in the world. There are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons. And there's nearly 16,400, there are 16,400 exactly, from what I understand, nuclear weapons. And they've reduced it from a very high level before, but it doesn't take very many nuclear weapons to be a problem. So believe me, so 16,400 reduced from nearly years and years ago, maybe 100,000 would be a nice reduction, but it's still not enough, okay? And if you saw what happened in Hiroshima, then you can get some idea of what happened in the Marshall Islands, where they did above-ground testing. And the power of the one that was used in Nagasaki was really a small one. They tested ones there that were 1,000 times what the power was in Nagasaki. And obviously you can understand why those people were a little bit, let's say, up in arms about the nuclear weapons testing that they did, because they did 67 of them. So the goal, that's what he'll be talking about today, is zero nukes, okay? So our speaker is Rick Wayman, and he has a BS in international business in 2001. He has an MA in the School from International Training in 2005. He's been involved in renewable energy, which is something that we've also discussed here, using solar energy and nuclear power. Incidentally, I also checked nuclear power plants while I was doing that, and there's more coming out of a coal-fired plant than there is out of a nuclear powered plant in terms of radiation. So nuclear power is not the issue, it's nuclear weapons. He's been a press and communications officer. He's on the board of directors of the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, and he's the director and program of operations for the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And he's been involved with the Marshall Islands, the Nuclear Zero lawsuit, that there's 10 of them actually. And he's going to give us some real background here as to what our nuclear policies are and what we as citizens can do to try to stop the increase in upgrading our nuclear power, our nuclear weapons. They're talking about spending $1 trillion to upgrade what we already have. Does that sound like money well spent? Doesn't to me, but we'll let Rick follow up with that, okay? Give us a big hand to Rick Wayman.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you to Jerry for your introduction and to Free Thought Arizona for having me here today. As Jerry mentioned, I'll be talking this morning about the state of nuclear weapons in the world today and what one country is doing about it. So just as a matter of introduction, on its own, talking about nuclear weapons, there are 16,000 nuclear weapons in the world. Like Jerry mentioned, the U.S. is planning to spend $1 trillion over the next 30 years to upgrade. As you'll see, many other countries have their own modernization efforts underway. Pretty demoralizing. So I don't want to leave you here with a real bad taste in your mouth, so I'm also going to talk about a real exciting campaign that my organization is working on together with dozens of other organizations around the world, and that is in support of the Marshall Islands and their lawsuits that they filed back in April. So I'll get much more into that as we go along. So this is how the Einstein thing came up. This is a quote from one of the people who is responsible for the whole conceptual basis behind the splitting of the atom and nuclear weapons. So Albert Einstein said, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe." Obviously, he said this many decades ago, but it really remains true today. Theories like mutual assured destruction and, to a greater extent, nuclear deterrence are still very prevalent and still carry a great deal of weight with decision makers in the nuclear-armed nations. The unparalleled catastrophe that Einstein talked about is now concrete scientific fact. Climate models show that the use of even 0.5% of the world's nuclear arsenal could result in a massive, decade-long famine, killing up to 2 billion people. So this is in addition to the devastating blast, fire effects, radiation effects that would be prevalent in the areas where the weapons are actually used. We're talking about a global famine. Even if it was India and Pakistan having a nuclear exchange, we here in the US would suffer the consequences. And I think that's a really great reason why everyone needs to come together to abolish these weapons. So, President Obama, this is a picture of him in 2009 in Prague. He gave a speech where he said that the U.S. will seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. He also said that as the only nation to have ever used nuclear weapons in war, the United States has a moral responsibility to act. So my question, how many nuclear weapons has the United States dismantled in the 6 years that President Obama has been in office? Any guesses? 0, okay. Any other guesses? 1. Okay, wow, all right, that was very specific. Fewer than any president going back to at least Reagan. Well, it's somewhere in between there. The answer is 309, which is about 6% of the total U.S. arsenal. So he's dismantled some weapons. But some more audience participation here. Which president do you think has eliminated the most nuclear weapons in the United States? Okay, I've heard Carter, I've heard Bush, I've heard Reagan. Well, Republicans are strong on defense, right? And nuclear weapons are essential for our defense, right? So, the first answer, I'm going to name the top 3 presidents. Third, Bill Clinton eliminated 3,182 nuclear warheads from the arsenal, about 23% of the total during the time that he was president. Next, we have George H.W. Bush. Almost 10,000 nuclear warheads were eliminated from the arsenal under his watch. And remember, he only had one term. And that's 41% of the total at that time. And number one on the list, George W. Bush, 50% of the U.S. nuclear arsenal he eliminated during his watch. That's a pretty impressive number, but I want to ask you, what is wrong with this picture here? Where's President Obama? Where is the president who promised to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons? Part of the answer is what he followed that very well-said line about seeking the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. He then said, "But I'm not naive. This won't happen in my lifetime." So, yeah, that's where we are today. And that is the president who won a Nobel Peace Prize largely for his statements about wanting to eliminate nuclear weapons. But to take it out of just the U.S. context, this is not a U.S. problem by any means. There are 9 nuclear-armed nations in the world. Russia currently has the most nuclear weapons at 8,000. This graph here is kind of a graphical interpretation of how many weapons each country has and the different types: submarine-based missiles, land-based missiles, bombs on airplanes, that sort of thing. But as you can see, the vast, vast majority, well over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons are in the possession of Russia and the United States. So these countries really have a particular responsibility here to act. In addition, and this is something that people don't really think about a lot, but there are still 5 other countries that are considered non-nuclear weapon states, but they have nuclear weapons on their territory. And this is through NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Cold War monster, or now dinosaur. There's still about 180 nuclear bombs spread among these 5 countries. This is a leftover from the Cold War. And regardless of the fact that no coherent case can be made for their continued possession and this continued arrangement, it continues nearly 25 years after the end of the Cold War. This graph here shows it shows all of the modernization plans for each country. So we've got our 9 nuclear-armed nations over there, and these are new weapon systems that are either in progress being developed or are planned. As you might expect, we've got the US and Russia modernizing all 3 legs of what they call the nuclear triad: air, land, and sea. So nuclear bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and submarines. China is in there as well, really contributing to the nuclear arms race. As you've heard a couple times already, the U.S. alone is planning to spend $1 trillion over the next 30 years on new nuclear submarines, bombers, and land-based missiles. So this is in addition to the tens of billions that it already spends annually just to maintain the weapons. And right now, the figure, it's hard. Many of these countries are much less transparent than the U.S. in terms of how the government spends money, but we think around $100 billion is spent globally each year on nuclear weapons. Just an interesting aside, we're talking about these huge, huge sums of money. Just the other day, the U.S. government in court argued that it would be too expensive to meet Washington State's deadlines to clean up Hanford. That was one of the main plutonium-producing areas in the world up in Washington State. So Washington's deadlines would add about $1.5 billion a year for the next 10 years. And the government is arguing that that's too much money. We can't spend that much money on cleanup. But we can spend all this money on producing new ones. So I think the priorities are very backward. In 1968, a treaty was negotiated called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Some of you may have heard it. It came into effect in 1970. Article 6 of that treaty requires all signatories to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. So this is 45 years ago that this treaty came into effect. The US and at the time Soviet Union, now Russia, agreed to all of the treaty, including Article 6. As I just showed you, the nuclear arms race is still happening. Many people, including some of the scientists at our nuclear weapons labs in New Mexico and Northern California, are calling this a new nuclear arms race. They're using that language themselves. But 45 years ago, no negotiations are in sight. So very disappointing, and the question really is, can we go on as a world indefinitely without progress and without completing these negotiations? In 1996, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion on the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. The opinion as a whole was not 100% clear, but they did say unanimously that there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects. So that brings us to today and what I'm really excited to talk about, which is one small country and what they are doing to force the nuclear-armed nations to fulfill their legal obligations. On April 24th, less than a year ago, the Marshall Islands, which is a small country in the middle of the Pacific, they filed lawsuits against all 9 nuclear-armed nations. They filed one lawsuit against the United States in U.S. Federal District Court in Northern California. They also filed 9 individual lawsuits, one for each of the nuclear-armed nations in the International Court of Justice. As of right now, 3 cases are going forward at the International Court. That's the United Kingdom, India, and Pakistan. And the reason those cases are going forward is those 3 countries accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court. The other 6 nuclear-armed nations do not respect the jurisdiction of the court, and therefore if a country sues them, they don't have to go and have the case heard if they don't want to. But the Marshall Islands has invited all 9 countries individually to come and have these cases heard at the ICJ. So far, as I mentioned, those 3, the UK, India, and Pakistan, are going forward. China has explicitly declined, as is their right. There's been no word from the other 5, which is the US, France, Israel, North Korea, and Russia, thank you. So no word from them yet. That's also their right to not answer at all. But it looks bad. Where's the good faith that they agreed to in Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty? But as I mentioned, there is a case going forward against the United States in U.S. Federal District Court. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But first, a little bit about the Marshall Islands. Small island nation, 70,000 people. If you take the total land mass of the Marshall Islands, it's about the size of Rhode Island with over 1 million square miles of ocean. so very spread out. As Jerry mentioned in his introduction, the U.S. conducted 67 nuclear weapon tests from 1946 to 1958. When the U.S. began these massive tests in the Marshall Islands, they were the only country that had nuclear weapons. They were in an arms race against themselves. No other country had them. The Soviet Union didn't develop them until 1949. That was their first test. An interesting and really terrible fact, if you take the total explosive yield of the 67 nuclear weapon tests in the Marshall Islands, that's the equivalent of 1.6 Hiroshima-sized bombs daily for 12 years. That fact really, I think, speaks for itself. And the March 1st, 1954 Castle Bravo test, that was the biggest nuclear weapon in terms of explosive yield ever detonated by the U.S. That was about 15 megatons, about 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that we dropped on the people of Hiroshima. Just a couple days ago, on Friday, we launched an online profiles campaign to tell the stories of individual Marshallese who have been impacted by nuclear weapons. Some of these effects, and they're really just terrible, include jellyfish babies, which are babies that are born without a skeleton, babies that have translucent skin. Some of the most horrible things you could really ever imagine. Many types of cancer, as you would expect. And another one that people might not necessarily think of, but really is a huge deal. A lot of the land in the Marshall Islands you can't grow food there. You can't eat the food that is grown there because of the ongoing contamination. So on Rongelap Atoll in particular, it was heavily contaminated. The U.S. took a long time to move the people off the island. They moved them back prematurely. Then Greenpeace actually came in and evacuated everyone again in 1985 because it was so horrible. Now the U.S. is trying to get them to move back, but the U.S. government itself is saying to the people who moved back, you can't eat more than a 30% local diet. 70% of your food has to be imported. So think about what that does in terms of diabetes, cholesterol levels, these kind of things. People have had to change their traditional way of life and their traditional way of eating, and it's very damaging to their health. So why would the Marshall Islands, a small nation, why would they take this courageous action, especially against its biggest economic supporter, the United States? Tony DeBroom is the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands. He's also the co-agent in the cases in the International Court of Justice. So he's very involved. He's been working for nuclear disarmament and separately for justice for nuclear testing victims for decades. And he said that our people have suffered the catastrophic and irreparable damage of these weapons, and we vow to fight so that no one else on earth will ever again experience these atrocities. So basically, he's saying the injury that has been caused to the people of the Marshall Islands is something that cannot happen again. It can't happen to anyone else. And like I said at the beginning, you don't have to have the immediate blast effects, the immediate fire effects, the immediate radiation effects. This can also affect any of us through, maybe for lack of a better term, nuclear winter, or what's now being called nuclear famine, through the amount of smoke that would be stuck blocking sunlight for up to a decade. So a little bit about the legal strategy of these cases. And I'm not a lawyer myself, but I talk to the legal teams a lot. And let me just start actually with a word about the legal teams that are working on these cases. These lawyers are all working completely pro bono. This is all on their own time. They're donating their time. No one is paying them for what they're doing. but they believe in it, and they believe that these cases really have a chance to change the trajectory of the world. Just Friday, there was a hearing in U.S. Federal District Court. So that's the case against the U.S. That is moving forward at this time. The U.S. is seeking dismissal of the lawsuit on technicalities. I think if any one of us was being sued, that would probably be the first thing that we would try to do, is get it thrown out of court somehow for some technicality. But they don't want to have the case heard on the merits. And so no matter what happens with this motion to dismiss, the U.S. is on notice, as are all the other nuclear-armed nations, that they cannot continue to be in breach of their obligations under international law. And a word on the case against the UK in the International Court. This is particularly interesting for them. They have national elections coming up in May, and we have a lot of partners in the UK that are really working to make this a huge issue in the election. Where do the politicians stand on nuclear weapons, on the UK's respect for international law? And also, the UK is due for a decision on whether or not to build new nuclear submarines. That would make them a nuclear-armed nation well into the 2050s. So is that something that they as a nation want to spend 100 billion pounds on, but also in terms of their relationship with international law, is that something that they want to do? Or do they want to be a global leader? Do they want to be recognized as a country that realized that what they're doing is not right and took the lead to make a change? A little bit on the education and advocacy strategy around the lawsuits, and that's where my organization, the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, comes in. So we see this as a very empowering campaign. A very not powerful nation, the Marshall Islands, standing up against the most powerful militarily nations in the world. There hasn't been comprehensive media coverage of this issue yet. That's kind of the way the media works. They wait until there's some kind of big ruling or big controversy that comes up before they rule on it. But out at the information table in the back, I do have copies of a New York Times article that ran in the Sunday edition 3 weeks ago about the lawsuits. A pretty in-depth piece in terms of how the mainstream media reports. And please do take a copy if you're interested and want to check that out. I'll also mention a petition that we're supporting for the leaders of the Marshall Islands, to let them know that there are people in the world that stand behind them. Currently, that petition is over 5 million strong and continues to grow. So there are paper copies out there if you want to sign there. I'll also show you the website in a minute where you can sign online at any time. But I did want to note, in this case, I believe that this petition is really important and is something that if you believe in this, you should sign. And a big reason for that is that I personally communicate with the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands on a regular basis, and I let him know how many people are signing this petition. He reports that to the cabinet, to the president, and it's reassuring to them to know that there's public support for what they're doing, because they are behind the scenes getting a really hard time from some of the governments that are being sued. These are some of the organizations around the world that are supporting the lawsuits and supporting the Marshall Islands in what they're doing. We've got peace groups, environmental groups, religious groups, economic justice groups, women's groups. Veterans for Peace is a big organization. I bet some of you here are members of Veterans for Peace. They've been great and been very involved in this. But I would encourage you, if you're a member of a group that might like to join in support of the Marshall Islands, just let me know and we can work on getting you signed up. And I'll just mention some of the things that other organizations do. lobbying other countries to join. So the organizations that have a big presence at the United Nations in particular have been working on getting other countries that believe in nuclear disarmament and international law to join into these lawsuits. They're going forward one way or another, but if other countries want to join in, all the better. Also engaging with media contacts, that's a very important role that any organization can play. Here are a few of the ways that I like to look at what the Marshall Islands is doing versus the Nuclear Nine. The picture's a good example. David versus Goliath, but in a more nonviolent way. There are no rocks involved, no slingshots involved. It's the law in the courtroom that they're using. The mouse that roared. One way that Foreign Minister de Broom often explains what he's doing in his leadership role with the lawsuits is friends don't let friends drive drunk. If you have a friend, and that's how the Marshall Islands views the United States, and you know they're about to make a terrible decision that could put themselves at risk and put others at risk, like driving drunk, but on a much larger scale, a good friend won't let them do that. And that's what the Marshall Islands is doing here. They're telling their friend, this is not okay, you're putting us all at risk, and you need to correct your behavior. But really, what they're showing is compassion, commitment, and courage in action. And I really admire their leadership. So we've seen the nuclear threat to humanity persists. The doctrines that were prevalent during the Cold War are still right there today. The US and Russia still have about 1,000 nuclear weapons each on high alert. They're ready to go within a couple minutes of an order. The nuclear zero lawsuits are an unprecedented opportunity to change how nations relate to nuclear weapons and to break this nearly 5-decade deadlock of no negotiations. And public support is very strong. More and more people are recognizing that the nuclear threat still exists and that it's our responsibility to do something about it. So I would encourage you to join us, to join the Marshall Islands in their effort in the courtrooms, and just talk about it with people. Let them know this is still an issue, this is still a very dangerous thing, and if we're to ensure a future for ourselves and future generations, we've got to do something now. So this is nuclearzero.org is the website for in support of the lawsuits. You can sign the petition there. You can learn more about the Marshall Islands, about the international legal obligations that are the basis for the lawsuits, and you can also read the actual court filings that were filed in the international court and in U.S. court. So I encourage you to check that out. We're always updating the site. And like I said before, if you're a part of any organizations that might want to get involved, please do. This is something that we're looking for local groups, national groups, international groups, anyone that wants to make a difference. There's something that they can do. So thank you all. There's a lot of nuclear weapon things. I didn't talk about Iran. Any questions that you have, I really welcome them, and hopefully we can have a lively discussion. Thank you.
For those of you who would like to, okay, like here.
Can you tell me where our 7,310 nuclear weapons are being warehoused geographically in the U.S.? Where are they?
Well, they're very spread out, and that's part of that is about what they call the survivability of a first strike. So if Russia were to want to decapitate us in terms of our nuclear arsenal, they need to be spread out so that Russia would have to expend thousands of their own nuclear weapons to get ours. But we have land-based missiles in Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, and Colorado, in individual silos spread out in the countryside. We have over a dozen, I think 16 nuclear weapons submarines, and at any given time there are a few of them under the ocean in places that are not public. We don't know where they are. And then there are a few that are in maintenance in Georgia or in Washington State. There are a lot in New Mexico that are being stored. There are a lot that are awaiting dismantlement in Texas at the Pantex plant in Amarillo. And let's see, Kings Bay, Georgia is a big submarine base. So yeah, those are the highlights, but they're very spread out, and I guess I didn't mention the ones that are meant for airplanes, and those are at various Air Force bases.
Okay, if you'll please put it in the form of a question, that would be good. Okay.
I just was wondering, your numbers don't seem to add up. If it was that George Bush destroyed 50% of the missiles so that it was down to 5,304, now it says the U.S. has 7,000. Have there been more being created all the time? Because it just sort of seems that with doing the numbers from both Bush, Clinton, and H.W. Bush, that the numbers just don't seem to add up. And the second point is that with in the Marshall Islands, with having the equivalent of a bomb go off each day for 12 years is the equivalent of 43,000 bombs, and if or 4,300 bombs, and yet you say that if 0.5% of the bombs that they have now, 0.5% of 16,000 went off, that would be devastating to 2 billion people. It just, I have difficulties with the numbers that you're giving out. I'm all for no nuclear weapons, but perhaps the math you might want to check a little bit or explain how it is that those numbers work, that a mathematician can't figure that out.
Sure. Those are really good questions, and I do have answers for you. So the numbers that I showed you for the presidents and how many warheads they removed from the arsenal, that's the number of warheads that they removed from the active arsenal. So they went from the active arsenal to be dismantled. A lot of those are still today in line to be dismantled. They haven't been dismantled yet. Nothing has been done to them. And there's really nothing to stop us from putting them back into service. Until they're actually physically dismantled at the Pantex plant in Texas, they're considered a nuclear weapon that we possess. And so that's why the numbers don't add up. Basically, assembling a nuclear weapon, you would imagine, is a pretty complex process. Disassembling a nuclear weapon is equally difficult, if not more difficult. In fact, some of the older nuclear weapons that are in line for dismantlement right now, they lost the blueprints. So they don't, you have to take each screw out in the order that in reverse order of how you assembled it. If you don't have the blueprints, you have to re-engineer that all over again. And so it's a very time-consuming process. But also, interestingly about Pantex, not only is it the place where they dismantle them, but it's also the place that they assemble nuclear weapons. So when they take a class of bomb or warhead in to replace the tritium or whatever it is that they have to do to keep it what they call reliable, there are only a certain number of bomb bays in Pantex that you can either use to disassemble or assemble. So if we have a lot of life extension programs going on where we're replacing components, those bomb bays are being taken up with assembly. And so our ones that are in line for dismantlement are just sitting there collecting dust. But technically, there's still active nuclear weapons that could be used. So hopefully that explains how why the numbers don't add up on face value. Your other question about the amount of nuclear weapons that the U.S. exploded in the Marshall Islands and why that didn't cause this climate chaos, this global famine, the key to that if 0.5% of the world's nuclear arsenal was used, it's against cities. So, you know, we're talking about against Delhi in India, for example, where you're using it against a densely populated area that has tons of buildings, a lot of things to burn. And in the Marshall Islands, it wasn't necessarily that case. So the amount of smoke that was created by the tests in the Marshall Islands is much less than the smoke that would be created by nuclear weapons detonating in cities. So that's why those numbers are a bit different.
If you have a question, I would like you to come up here so that we can video you and get it on tape, okay? Thank you.
I have two brief questions, if I may. First question is, does anyone know how many weapons from the former Soviet arsenal are unaccounted for?
Oh, not exactly. And I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, but we don't know. And there are groups that are dedicated to reducing that threat, to getting those locked up. But there was a long time where the security was just not there. I've heard quotes from people saying that you know, an auto junkyard in the U.S. is better protected than some of these places in the former Soviet Union that contained nuclear weapons. You know, they just had a chain link fence with a padlock on it. So we don't know necessarily, and part of that disgusting arms race that was happening during the Cold War, they were pumping out nuclear weapons left and right, and the accounting was just not there. So we're not 100% sure, but there are people out there who are doing their best, and really that's all you can do at this point is try to get it all locked down and try to figure it out. But I don't think anyone's ever going to know for sure.
Well, then my second and possibly related question is, do nuclear strategists speculate on who might be most likely to actually use a nuclear weapon?
Well,
and in what scenario?
Okay. Well, I think there are a lot of different opinions on that. What we hear a lot today is about the threat of nuclear terrorism. So not necessarily a nation state, but what you might call a rogue group getting their hands on one. Maybe it's one that was stolen in the post-Soviet chaos. Maybe it's one that comes out through Pakistan, or who knows. That is very possible, absolutely. Others see a great threat from North Korea, although they don't have the means to deliver a nuclear weapon at this point. But, you know, like I showed in the graphs here, the US and Russia have well over 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world. And it doesn't have to be something that is on purpose for a nuclear war to start. It could be a miscalculation. It could be a technical glitch. There have been many instances in the past where training tapes have been left inadvertently in real-time military rooms, and they're simulating a nuclear attack, and people really think they're under attack. Call the president, you know, and this whole process is going on, and there are only minutes to decide. It's a very high-pressure, high-stakes thing. So that's another way that a nuclear war could start, is completely by accident, with no malintent on anyone's part, but because the rapid response systems are in place, it's hard to stop once it starts. Yeah, any number of scenarios could happen, and they're all quite terrifying.
Is there any effort to align the momentum or lack of momentum between the efforts for climate change with the getting rid of nuclear weapons? Because they seem to be equally laggard. They're pressing, but they're also equally laggard.
Well, that's a great question, and the Marshall Islands is really taking a leadership role on both of those issues. They are one of the most vulnerable nations in terms of rising sea levels. I think they're on average about 6 feet above sea level. So, it's a very, very real existential threat to them. And they've taken a very strong leadership role in the international climate negotiations. An interesting fact on that, Foreign Minister de Bruym was in Lima about a month ago for the negotiations that are leading up to this year's big Paris summit. And there was some compromise language that, the nations that really want to act strongly to arrest climate change to the extent that we can, versus those who want less strict regulations. There was some compromise language that all the countries were asked to vote on, and Foreign Minister de Bruym said, I cannot vote for this compromise language because it would spell the end of my nation. What that compromise would have led to was enough of a temperature rise that the seas would rise and swallow up the islands. And so it's pretty hard for me to fathom that level of real existential threat. But that's what we're talking about with climate change. And really that's in many ways what we're talking about with nuclear weapons as well, if they are ever used. And so the Marshall Islands leadership, I think, is important. Tony de Bruym often brings up the connections. He also says it doesn't do us much good to fight and stop climate change if we're going to turn around and have the world ruined by the use of nuclear weapons. So he makes that connection very strongly. We are working with a lot of environmental organizations on kind of jointly making these points. A lot of great thinkers of today identify climate change and nuclear weapons as the two threats, the two top existential threats facing humanity. And yeah, climate change has a bit more traction, I think, publicly right now, and we definitely want to work together with our partners in that movement.
I'm a member of Physicians for Social Responsibility, which was founded about 50 years ago for the purpose of nuclear disarmament. As you can tell, we haven't done worth a damn on that. But the organization now, among other things, is working very hard also on climate change. And so, yes, there is a good connection working there. There's so many organizations now working on so many things. We're trying to combat evil wherever it exists. My question is, we are being told now somebody's going to publish something about doomsday countdown pretty soon. And we want to have letters to the editor in, and I would like to know if your figures and so forth are available in some printable form that I might be able to get hold of at the end of the meeting. I did not take notes as I should have been, So that's one question.
Okay, great, thank you. So first, I will mention that Physicians for Social Responsibility and their the related international group, which is International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, they've both been very strong supporters of the Marshall Islands lawsuits, and really are doing fantastic work, both on nuclear disarmament, as you said, but also a lot of other issues. The physicians here in the U.S., focusing a lot on coal pollution, things like that as well, that really make a difference to the health of people. In terms of the figures that I was mentioning here, they're absolutely available online, and I think the best source, the source that I always turn to members of Congress, really everyone, this guy is really seen as the international go-to on all things nuclear weapon numbers. His name is Hans Christensen. He works with the Federation of American Scientists, and yeah, like I said, he knows his stuff backwards and forwards. He publishes a blog, and I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but if you were to even search on Google for Federation of American Scientists nuclear weapons, you would find it very easily, and they're all there. He's got lots of colorful graphs and tries to put the information out in a way that's understandable to a non-scientist.
Good morning. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. It's been very, very helpful bringing this back. I'm the state chapter director for Physicians for Social Responsibility. It was brought to our attention in the last couple of years that over $1 billion has been paid out by the Department of Justice to victims of nuclear fallout, either in northern Arizona alone or in the region. And cancer victims can just claim reparations from the Department of Justice if they lived in the region when fallout from the nuclear testing occurred. And I'm wondering if you considered using this kind of information to bring it home to people in the United States to realize that we're still suffering the consequences, and nuclear weapons testing as well as nuclear weapons entirely have to be eradicated. Is this something that's been used at all?
We have not used it a great deal, but we have worked with some of the testing victims. They call themselves downwinders, meaning you live downwind from the Nevada test site. And yeah, their stories are really just as heartbreaking as the ones of those in the Marshall Islands, except it has that special case where it's your own government doing it, and for many, many decades denying that it was a problem. So, yeah, I mean, in Nevada, it used to be kind of a tourist attraction to go and check out the mushroom clouds, and they marketed their state that way. The postcards, and there's an atomic bomb museum there now that has all that memorabilia, and it's really, really terrible stuff. But yeah, there are downwinders and there are advocates that are seeking some sort of justice. I mean, no dollar amount is going to pay for the damage that was caused to health and families and that which is even passed down through generations.
But I don't think we talk about these issues enough nowadays. And a lot of us in this community went to Nevada not to be a tourist, but to protest the testing.
Yeah.
Just want to make that point.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, and yeah, thank you for doing that. Maybe this is something that that PSR and my organization and others can work together on. I think that's really important. The voices and the stories of these people right here in the U.S. Are really important to bringing that point home.
As I mentioned, when I was in the public health service, we did monitoring from around the weapons test site and, of course, throughout the country, and all of our information was classified. So the Atomic Energy Commission classified the public health service monitoring of the weapons. they thought they could trace back how big it was or something. So it was very discouraging.
Yeah, well, just a note on classification and confidentiality. Some of the meetings that I have with members of Congress when I go to D.C. to talk about these issues, their fallback position, if they're a supporter of our nuclear weapons program, is if you only knew what I knew that's in these confidential documents, but I can't tell you about that. And so, I mean, it's kind of, I don't know, maybe there's something to that, but to me it really feels like a cop-out, that it's only secret information that is justifying the ongoing possession of nuclear weapons and the ongoing threat that represents.
I think one theme that I'm hearing here is kind of in reference to the way massive change comes about. The civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, started with, groundswell of popular support, which eventually led to the legal and institutional change. So, I mean, this is great what you're doing. One issue that comes to mind, I didn't hear you talk about the actual literal monetary cost in these, fiscally conservative times that we live in. The War Resisters League, for example, publishes the true pie graph of what weapons cost as opposed to what's officially published by the federal government. And I wonder if that could be one kind of spark towards, increasing popular consciousness of the money that comes out of each of our pocketbooks, much less the survival issues, of course, but something that fiscal conservatives, the Ron and Rand Pauls of the world, and peace activists can agree on, that can hopefully be used to show how important this is, and lead to the on the ground, the support that's needed to move this forward.
Yeah, that's a great question, and in a way it takes me back to the quote that I opened with from Albert Einstein about a failure to change our modes of thinking. And like I said, there are a lot of people out there who continue to believe that nuclear weapons keep us safe, and we have to have them in order to be safe. And if you believe that, and like I said, there are plenty of people who truly believe that, what amount of money is too much to keep yourself truly safe? I mean, I would do absolutely anything I could to ensure the safety of my 5-year-old daughter, without a question. So if I believed that nuclear weapons were the way to do that, I think that's how one might justify these unbelievable dollar amounts that are being spent. Even by those who otherwise identify themselves as fiscal conservatives. But before moving to California in 2007 to work with the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, I was working in London for the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which is a UK-based group working obviously for nuclear disarmament, but primarily focusing on the UK itself. And one of the campaigns that really got a lot of public traction there is comparing what is being proposed to spend on new nuclear submarines versus some of the very, very tangible cuts that are being proposed to things that a lot of people love, like the National Health Service, for example. And obviously, schools and firefighters and all these things that are very real and most people identify as being very positive contributors to society. So that has gotten a lot of traction and has won a lot of people over in support. I'll just give you an example in terms of numbers of how that happened. We launched that campaign in 2005 in the UK, and we had about, in public polling, we had less than 30% of people in the UK were on our side. So about 70% of the people thought, oh, okay, we'll renew our nuclear weapons system, fine. By the end of that 2-year campaign, before Parliament voted, 72% of people were on our side. And really our argument was largely based around the money issue, and it worked in that case. And so I think you're right that a lot of people speak with the dollar sign.
Maybe this is classified, but I was just wondering, the fuel that are used in nuclear power plants, is that a separate supply from, say, a supply that's obtained from defusing a nuclear weapon?
Well, that's not classified. So there are a couple things that I'll mention here. So one is there was a program for a long time. It was cooperation between the Russians and the U.S. on drawing down the Russian nuclear stockpile. And so they would take the highly enriched uranium from retired Russian nuclear weapons, downblend it into fuel that could be used in nuclear power plants, and they would use that fuel in American nuclear reactors. So for a long time, about 10% of the electricity that was consumed in the United States was directly from these old Soviet nuclear weapons. So really interesting thing that was happening there. Some people would say we finally made some kind of social benefit from an otherwise horrible and wasteful weapon. So anyway, that is one way that of what they do with some of this waste or fuel from nuclear weapons. And let's see. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is the U.S. in particular really claims that its nuclear energy industry and its military nuclear industry are totally separate. And to a certain extent, that's true. But there is a nuclear power plant that's part of the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's in Alabama. I believe it's Browns Ferry. Anyway, they produce tritium for nuclear weapons at the nuclear power plant. So that's a very clear connection between the two. But yeah, for the most part, the nuclear energy is something that stands on its own, apart from the weapons. But there is a lot of opportunity for crossover, and that's why, for example, with Iran, we see a lot of controversy because you can't always tell what's a peaceful intention, what's a peaceful use, and what is a non-peaceful use. So there's definitely a lot of question marks there.
Hi. You just brought up Iran, and that kind of gets to where my question is. Let's assume that we're able to annihilate all these weapons that are in possession now. How do you then prevent a new rogue nation or terrorist group such as ISIS from developing a new weapon where they wouldn't have any qualms at all about using it on specific locations that might not then retaliate? So, I mean, it goes back to the mutual assured destruction argument, but, can you give me some idea of how we're going to assure that we stay at zero once we get to zero?
Sure. Well, part of that is that's what needs to be negotiated among all nations, among the nuclear armed nations and the non-nuclear nations. And however that plays out, I don't know how that will play out, but clearly, as a world, we're not going to be able to go to zero unless that question is solved. I would say, I don't have a specific answer, but I would say we as humans were clever enough to create nuclear weapons. We need to be clever enough to eliminate them. And I believe that we can. There are efforts. The UK and Norway have a joint project on verification. So that would be to tell exactly how many nuclear weapons are being eliminated by each country as this process moves forward of going to zero. And the International Atomic Energy Agency ostensibly will be able to tell. This is something that all nations are going to have to sign on to. Some fairly aggressive verification procedures and inspections by the IAEA. That's all we can do, because to a certain extent, we have to trust one another, but also we scientifically do need to verify not only that all the nuclear weapons that currently exist are eliminated, but also, like you said, that no new ones are produced. And I think that with monitoring of all the facilities that can produce these weapons, I think that it's possible, and I think that it will be done.
One bright spot is we could solve the climate increase by using 5/10 of the nuclear weapons, and the temperature would drop considerably. Is that not true?
Well, the temperature would drop, but
so would we.
It would drop to an extent where in the vast majority of the world, it would get below freezing every night, and so we wouldn't be able to grow crops.
Shucks.
You know, it's I don't think that's
the solution
that's quite
is worse
the geoengineering solution that we're looking for in terms of climate change.
We talked earlier, and you said you could mention a few things about the negotiations that are taking place in Iran and what the status of their situation is. What do we know about their capabilities and what we're trying to retrieve from the capability that they have?
Okay, sure. So as you've probably read or heard in the media, the negotiations with Iran are ongoing around their nuclear weapons program. Well, I misspoke, around their nuclear program, what some call their nuclear weapons program. There's no evidence that they currently have a nuclear weapons program. Even the intelligence agencies in the U.S. would tell you that. But it goes really to the problem of dual-use technologies. What Iran wants to do and what it's asserting its right to do is to enrich uranium to a certain percentage so that it is self-sustaining in terms of its nuclear fuel cycle. It can produce its own fuel for what they say is nuclear power plants. And what it comes down to is if you can enrich uranium to 8% or 20%, for the most part, it's only a matter of time and fine-tuning to enrich it to 80 or 90%, which is what you need for a highly enriched uranium nuclear weapon. So that, part of what they're trying to work out is how high of a percentage can they go to in enriching, what is necessary, who's going to be the guardian of this fuel. There have been proposals for Russia to be the guardian of the fuel that Iran creates, and all these things. It's pretty. It's been a very intractable situation. There are a lot of politicians and people in both the U.S. and Iran that want to solve this issue and believe that it can be solved. There are a lot of hardliners on both sides that don't want it to be solved. The new Congress right now is talking about implementing new sanctions, economic sanctions against Iran, which could derail these talks. And if that happens, who knows? I mean, Iran has always proclaimed its opposition to nuclear weapons and said, they're against Islamic law and they're just not something that we're interested in. Whether they're telling the truth or not, I mean, only they know at this point. But yeah, the negotiations are kind of dominated by the U.S. and Iran, but they're called the P5+1, which is the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council plus Germany.
I'll quote Reagan, trust but verify. And so I think that's an important thing, too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just to be clear about the connection between the fuel for nuclear power plants and the enriched uranium and other plutonium for nuclear weapons, it is indeed the same exact technology for the mining, the milling, the enrichment, and the fabrications in terms of the technologies that are required, whether we're making fuel for a nuclear-powered submarine, a commercial nuclear power plant, or enriching uranium and plutonium for nuclear weapons. Is that not the case, that it is exactly the same technology, and indeed in the United States, the same factories that enrich the uranium?
You know, I'm not sure about the last point about whether it's the same facilities in the U.S. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but
at least
yeah,
historically.
it is the same process in terms of enriching uranium. It has to go through the centrifuge process, and whether you enrich it to 5%, which is what we use in a
you might agree that in imagining nuclear power as a solution towards climate change, that would also necessarily involve the proliferation of these technologies for making nuclear weapons.
Well, I do believe that it's going to be much more difficult to verify that none of it is being diverted for weapons. Absolutely, and that's a huge problem. But also, what I haven't mentioned is Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I've been talking a lot about Article 6, which is the part about nuclear disarmament. Article 4 enshrines what it says in the treaty is the inalienable right to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So, you know, that is an element of international law right now, and that's something else that countries are going to have to come to grips with when nuclear disarmament negotiations are happening. Absolutely, it would be very difficult for me to envision a world with verifiably zero nuclear weapons, especially if even more countries have enrichment technology.
And then a separate question, just for the education of the audience here, maybe you can spend a few words to follow up on Howard's question about follow the money. The nature of the National Nuclear Security Administration, which administers and directs the nuclear weapons production facilities at Los Alamos, Kansas City, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and how they are a private corporation. If you can maybe elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure, that's a great question. So the National Nuclear Security Administration it's a kind of a semi-autonomous branch of the U.S. Department of Energy. Its main nuclear weapons labs are Los Alamos in New Mexico and Lawrence Livermore National Lab in Livermore, California, outside the Bay Area. And for a long time, since the labs were created, Los Alamos in the 40s, Livermore in the 50s, for a long time, they were managed by the University of California. So the UC system was pumping its physics and engineering students into this pipeline, but also giving the nuclear weapons labs kind of a fig leaf of academic standing. And that situation lasted until, gosh, I don't know, maybe 2005 or 6 or something like that. And at that time, the management, it was up for a new bid. And so the University of California went in on a bid with Bechtel and a few other corporations, and they formed a for-profit company. It's a for-profit LLC, I think, to manage the labs. And so the labs have gone from management by essentially a nonprofit, a university, to an entity that has huge profit responsibilities. You know, they have to return an ever-increasing profit margin in order to satisfy their ownership. And it's led to a lot of shortcuts. It's led to a lot of security problems. And it's not a pretty sight what's happening at these labs. And part of it is you could argue that the government is typically incompetent with a lot of things and security and going over budget on projects and that sort of thing. But what we're seeing is it's a whole different level of greed and mismanagement and really just poor performance by the for-profit management consortium now.
I'd like you to comment on your shirt that you're involved in the No Nukes Begin in the U.S. Could you care to comment?
Well, 5 years ago, prior to the NPT review in 2010, I was just in New York City, and the War Resisters League, which is a pacifist organization that dates back to the 1920s, sponsored demonstrations, and they say no nukes begins with the U.S. because as American citizens, I believe we have a moral responsibility to address our own nation's nuclear weapons. That's our problem. That's where our responsibility lies, not that there aren't international obligations and responsibilities that we all have.
Thanks.
I had read an article some time ago, quite a while ago, I think, about the development of the nuclear stuff in Los Alamos, and this writer noted that there were different elements experimented with, and that some would put off heat but would not explode, so they were discarded with that. And he was wondering why, in this age now, when we don't need a bomb, why they could not go back and try to develop some of those that would develop heat without exploding. And do you know anything about any of those elements, or if anything's being done in the present to change our way of nuclear energy?
No, I don't know. I don't know about those. One thing that I have heard some talk about, and really a weapon that would highly affect the way that most of us operate in the world now, is electromagnetic pulse weapons, which would knock out the electrical grid, fry all of our computers and phones and all of that sort of thing. Basically knock out communications, knock out power. As we saw in Fukushima, if power is knocked out and backup generators don't work, that could lead to meltdowns in nuclear power plants. So it's a weapon that wouldn't necessarily have huge destructive, buildings wouldn't be flattened and burned for miles of radius, but it would be a hugely damaging weapon. So that's one thing that I've heard about, but no, I've not heard much about what you're referring to.
Okay.
Just getting back to the human factor in terms of the control of nuclear weapons, could you relate what happened many, many years ago when a weather rocket was launched by the U.S. and then misinterpreted as a nuclear weapon by the Russians, and how and why that happened?
Yeah, sure. So this is one of the many instances that almost accidentally led to nuclear war. I believe it was in 1995 or thereabouts, mid-90s anyway, post-Soviet Union. And the U.S. launched a weather rocket from somewhere off the coast of Norway. And they had notified their Russian counterparts, as they were supposed to, but that message didn't work its way up the chain on the Russian side. And so some people who were monitoring radars on the Russian side saw this come up, and it happened to be exactly in line with how an intercontinental ballistic missile fired from the continental U.S. would come over to Russia. So these people the Russian monitors who had no idea that it was a weather rocket, interpreted they did their job, essentially, which was to identify a nuclear attack. They implemented their emergency procedures. Boris Yeltsin was woken up. It was the middle of the night. It was like 3 in the morning or something. He was woken up, and he managed to make a coherent decision to hold off, to not immediately send out a response. And And that's the way that, that we averted a nuclear war in that sense.
From what my memory was, that's exactly the way it happened. But it also happened because one person didn't pass on the word up to the higher stretches of the Russian
Oh, I think that
bureaucracy.
actually might be a different. This happened a lot. So there's a guy named Stanislav Petrov, and he was a commander on a nuclear submarine. And I can't remember the story. There's actually a movie that is kind of on limited release right now called The Man Who Saved the World. And it's about his story. But I'm going to be telling this slightly wrong, but essentially what happened is I think there were 3 commanders on the Russian nuclear sub, and they lost contact with their people on land, and they had reason to believe that they needed to fire their nuclear weapons. 2 of the commanders agreed to it, but they couldn't do it unless all 3 agreed. And Petrov is the one who said, no, we're not going to do this. And obviously he ended up being right, but he obviously also prevented a nuclear exchange from beginning.
And we want to thank Rick again for a wonderful presentation and give him a big round of applause.